Imagine surviving the brutal Roman arena only to face a new battle outside of it. You might think retirement for a gladiator meant peace and luxury, but the truth is far more shocking. Would you truly survive the harsh realities of a gladiator's life after the arena? Stick around, and before we dive in, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Let us see if you could outlast Rome as most dangerous retirement. For the gladiator, freedom was the dream that kept him standing after endless nights in the barracks, the hope that pushed him to raise his shield one more time against a charging opponent, the vision that carried him forward when blood blurred his eyes and his body begged for rest. Freedom was not wealth, not glory, not the roar of the crowd. It was the one thing he could never truly fight for inside the arena, because the right to live or die was never in his hands. Yet there came a moment, rare and electrifying, when a man who had spilled enough blood for Rome was granted the wooden sword, the rudes. It was not sharp, it was not made for battle, and yet it could cut through the chains of slavery more decisively than any blade of iron. To the crowd, this was a ceremony, a spectacle. To the gladiator, it was the end of one life and the frightening beginning of another. Imagine the scene. The amphitheater is filled with 50,000 voices that thunder and echo like a storm. The sun beats down on the sand where countless men have fallen, where lions have roared and spears have struck. A gladiator kneels, victorious yet exhausted, his body trembling with wounds and the weight of his years. He has survived what most never dreamed possible. Years of combat, endless duels, beasts released from cages, the constant risk of dying for the entertainment of strangers. He waits, silent as the sponsor of the games, a powerful Roman with wealth and pride to display, raises a hand. The crowd falls into a hush, sensing that something rare is about to occur. And then, instead of death, instead of another match, the gladiator is handed a simple wooden sword. The crowd erupts in cheers, for they know what it means. This man who has fought as a slave is now free. But freedom was not as simple as it looked from the stands. The crowd went home satisfied, telling themselves they had witnessed history, a moment of mercy and honor. The sponsor basked in applause, seen as a man of generosity. Yet for the gladiator clutching the rudes, the truth was both exhilarating and terrifying. He now belonged to no one. He was no longer fed by the training school, no longer housed in the barracks, no longer guaranteed meals, medical care, or the structured life that had defined his existence for years. He walked away with scars covering his body, with joints twisted by years of strain, with bones that never healed straight, with skin that carried the deep lines of lashes and blades. He had his freedom, but what was he to do with it? The price of freedom was not just the wounds on his body, but the emptiness of his future. In Rome, status mattered more than anything, and a man who had been a gladiator carried a mark that never faded. In the arena, he had been celebrated, admired, even adored as a hero by the same people who would now avoid him in the marketplace. The paradox of Roman society was cruel. Inside the amphitheater, a gladiator was an idol, his name chanted, his victories sung in taverns. Outside the gates, he was a man of shameful origin, a former slave, a criminal, or a prisoner of war who had been forced to kill for amusement. Freedom could release him from chains, but not from the whispers that followed him down every street. For many, survival after retirement was harder than survival in combat. Some had earned prize money during their careers, but most of it had gone to trainers, owners, or had been wasted on fleeting pleasures. A handful of champions, the rare few who captured Rome's heart again and again, left the arena wealthy enough to open taverns, buy land, or live comfortably. But they were exceptions. The majority walked away with little more than their rudies and their scars. Their bodies were too damaged for heavy labor, their reputations too stained for respectable work, their skills too narrow for anything but fighting. It is no wonder that some returned to the life they had tried to escape. The arena had been cruel, but it was also the only place where they were respected, where their names meant something, where their skill mattered. A retired gladiator could become a trainer, teaching the next generation of fighters, his scarred body now a living lesson. Others became referees, or even returned as guest fighters, risking everything once more because life outside felt even more dangerous than death within the arena walls. There were men who re-enlisted willingly, not because they were forced, but because the outside world offered them nothing but hunger and loneliness. Even those who avoided the sand often found themselves drawn into other forms of violence. Rome was a city of power, where senators, generals, and wealthy merchants competed for influence. A gladiator's strength, even a broken one, was a commodity. Retired fighters became bodyguards, hired muscle for corrupt patrons, or thugs in the service of political gangs. They fought not for the cheers of a crowd, but for coins slipped into their hands, for scraps of bread, for the favor of a man who would discard them the moment they were no longer useful. Their freedom meant they were their own masters, but it also meant they were vulnerable, without protection, without loyalty, without the structure that had once kept them alive. The psychological burden was as heavy as the physical one. A gladiator who had lived years under the control of trainers and owners suddenly found himself standing alone, uncertain how to navigate the simplest parts of daily life. How do you buy food? Where do you sleep? Who do you trust when every companion you once had was also a rival? When every friend you buried was also a reminder that you were supposed to die too? The silence after the crowd was unbearable for some. The roar of 50,000 voices haunted their dreams. The memories of blood and death never left them. Many drowned themselves in drink, others grew bitter and violent, and some vanished into the dark corners of the city, where no one cared whether they lived or died. Roman writers liked to tell tales of the gladiator who won his freedom and became a legend, who lived in luxury and seduced noble women, who dined in the houses of senators and was celebrated long after he left the arena. These stories made for good entertainment, but they were exceptions, not the rule. Most of the men who walked away with the rudies faded into obscurity, their names forgotten, their bodies broken, their swords collecting dust in small, cramped homes. The myths lived on because people preferred to believe in heroes, but the reality was that freedom often meant another kind of struggle, one less visible, but no less brutal. And so we return to the question, would you survive a gladiator's retirement? You have endured the arena, the beasts, the swords, the endless nights in chains. You have stood victorious when so many others fell. The wooden sword is in your hand. The crowd is cheering your name one last time. But when the gates close behind you and the cheers fade into silence, what will you do? Will you find a way to carve a life out of the scars you carry, to turn fame into opportunity, to fight the unseen battles of poverty, stigma, and despair? Or will freedom itself prove to be the hardest opponent of all? This was the price of freedom, For some, it was a gift beyond measure. For most, it was a burden too heavy to bear. The gates close. The wooden sword rests in your hand. The crowd's thunderous cheer still echoes in your ears, but the silence that follows is deafening. For the first time in years, there is no trainer barking orders, no guard dragging you to the barracks, no morning bell demanding your body rise to fight. You are free. And yet, in Rome, freedom is never so simple. The man who leaves the arena with his rudies carries more than scars on his skin. He carries a brand burned into his very identity. He has survived the amphitheater, but he cannot escape what he has become in the eyes of society. To the Roman people, gladiators existed in a strange paradox. On the sand, they were adored, cheered like champions, admired for their courage, skill, and sheer defiance of death. Songs were written about their victories, and taverns buzzed with their names. Yet the moment they stepped beyond the arena's walls, all that glory dissolved. They were not respected citizens, not men of honor, but reminders of violence and shame. For in Roman culture, the arena was both a place of entertainment and a place of degradation. To fight as a gladiator was to become less than human, a creature meant to amuse, a slave even if one was once a free man. And when retirement came, the brand of that humiliation did not vanish. Imagine walking through a Roman street. The market is alive with chatter, vendors selling bread, wine, olive oil, the smell of roasted meat hanging in the air. People recognize you. Whispers rise. Some stare at the scars on your arms, the crooked way you walk after years of broken bones. Some nudge their companions, pointing at you as the man they once saw defeat 3 opponents in a single match. Yet admiration is fleeting. Others mutter under their breath, reminding their children not to look too closely, warning them that you are a man who has lived with blood on his hands. To some, you are a celebrity. To others, you are nothing more than a savage who belongs behind the arena's gates. Fame cannot wash away stigma. Even employers were hesitant. Work was hard to find for an ex-gladiator. Farmers looked at your body and saw someone too broken to till the land. Merchants saw your reputation and worried that customers would avoid their stalls if you worked for them. Artisans and craftsmen dismissed you because you had no trade, no skill, but fighting. You were trained to kill, not to build, not to carve wood, not to shape bronze. And while soldiers were honored, gladiators were not. A soldier fought for Rome. A gladiator fought for a spectacle. The difference meant everything. To enlist in the legions after retirement was nearly impossible. The stigma followed you everywhere. And then there were the social walls. Roman society was obsessed with status, with rank, with bloodlines. A freed gladiator could never rise high. He might earn coin if he was lucky, even enough to live comfortably, but he would never sit in the Senate, never command respect from noblemen, never be truly seen as their equal. Even marriage was complicated. Freed gladiators might find wives among slaves, freedwomen, or the poor. But respectable Roman families would not give their daughters to men who had lived and fought like beasts for the amusement of others. The stigma poisoned not just work, but relationships, friendships, love. It was as though the arena had marked you for life, and that brand burned deeper than any scar. Some ex-gladiators tried to embrace their notoriety, using their names as currency. They lingered in taverns, where drunk men would buy them wine just to hear stories of the sand. They allowed themselves to be paraded by wealthy patrons at banquets, a living trophy meant to impress guests. But this too was another kind of slavery. You were free in name, but you were still an object, something to be displayed, consumed, used for amusement. And when your fame faded, as all fame did, you were discarded as quickly as the wooden cups tossed aside after a feast. The cruelty was sharper because it contrasted so harshly with the memory of the crowd's adoration. Inside the arena, every movement you made was met with shouts of approval or condemnation. You were the center of Rome's attention. Outside, you were a shadow. For some, that silence was unbearable. Many men found themselves haunted by the absence of noise, by the emptiness of streets, compared to the arena's thunder. Their victories meant nothing once they stepped away. Rome did not honor its gladiators with statues or monuments. Heroes of war might be immortalized, generals might be celebrated, but gladiators were forgotten the moment the sand was raked smooth for the next spectacle. And so many slipped into lives that mirrored their past. They became hired muscle, selling their skills as bodyguards for corrupt men of power, or joining gangs that roamed the streets of Rome, clashing in alleys instead of arenas. Some became mercenaries traveling beyond the city to fight for coins in the provinces. Their reputation as killers never left them, so they leaned into it, surviving as best they could by being what society already believed them to be. They were branded forever, and that brand dictated their choices. But the deepest wound was not visible. It was the knowledge that no matter how many years they survived, no matter how many scars they bore, Rome would never let them truly belong. The Rudis freed their bodies, but not their souls. Every time they walked past the amphitheater, every time the roar of a crowd carried through the streets, they were reminded of who they were and who they would always be in the eyes of others. A gladiator, a man who lived for blood, a man who could never be more than the sum of his battles. Now, imagine yourself in that position. You have done the impossible. You have survived. You step into the world beyond the arena, clutching freedom in your hand, only to find that the world does not welcome you. Employers turn you away. Neighbors whisper. Strangers look at you with awe one moment and contempt the next. You are free, yes, but free to struggle, free to starve, free to wander a city that never forgets what you were. Would you survive this life after the arena, when the chains that bound you were no longer on your wrists, but in the minds of everyone around you? Would you find a way to turn fame into fortune, or would you be crushed by the weight of the brand you can never erase? For the gladiator, retirement was never a simple escape. It was another fight, invisible but relentless. And unlike the battles fought on sand, there was no crowd to cheer you on, no emperor to raise his hand and grant you mercy. There was only the quiet, the judgment, the brand that clung to you forever. To be freed was to begin again, but to begin again already marked as something you could never change. That was the truth of life after the arena freedom that was never truly free. The moment a gladiator stepped beyond the arena walls as a freed man, the battle for his life was far from over. If the sand of the amphitheater had demanded his blood, then the streets of Rome demanded something far more exhausting, his dignity. He might have held a wooden sword in his hand, the token of his freedom, but society's eyes were sharper than any blade, cutting into his very sense of self. Rome never forgot, and Rome never forgave. To have been a gladiator was to be marked forever, and that mark was carved deeper than scars could ever run. Respect in Rome was built on ancestry, honor, and service. To be born into a noble family was to inherit prestige. To fight in the legions was to win the respect of fellow citizens, for a soldier's blood was shed in defense of Rome, not in its amusements. To succeed in trade or politics was to build power that echoed across generations. But for a gladiator, there was no path into these realms. He could fight for Rome's entertainment. He could bleed and suffer before the eyes of its citizens. He could survive impossible odds and become a name shouted by thousands. But none of it erased the fact that he had once been property. Society did not reward the survivor. It branded him with disgrace. Even those who admired the strength of ex-gladiators kept their admiration at a distance. They were drawn to the spectacle, but not to the man. They might boast of having seen him fight, might pay him to tell stories of the sand, but they would never invite him into their homes as an equal. To dine beside senators or sit among knights of Rome was unthinkable for a man whose past dripped with blood. The gladiator, no matter how skilled or beloved, was always an outsider. He had been entertainment, and entertainment was never respected once the show was over. This stigma was not just social, but deeply personal. A retired gladiator would feel it in every encounter. A merchant might pause when he recognized the scars across the man's arms, then shake his head and mutter that he could not be trusted with coin. A mother might pull her child away in the marketplace, whispering that the man they stared at once fought for his life like an animal. A neighbor might nod politely, but lock his door a little tighter at night. Each gesture was small, but together they built an invisible wall higher than any the gladiator had ever faced in combat. He was no longer chained by iron, but he was still imprisoned by perception. The struggle for respect often drove ex-gladiators into roles that society grudgingly accepted. Some opened taverns, turning their notoriety into a business. Patrons would come not just for the wine, but to see the scarred man behind the counter, to hear stories of lions, duels, and near-death escapes. Others became trainers at the very schools where they had once been students, passing down their knowledge to a new generation of fighters who would face the same brutal cycle. A few gained steady work as bodyguards for the wealthy, their physical presence enough to intimidate rivals and reassure patrons. Yet even in these roles they were not respected for who they were, but for what they could still do with their bodies. Their value remained tied to violence. But what about those who wanted more? What of the gladiator who dreamed not of taverns or training schools, but of a life where he was treated as a man among men? That path was the hardest of all. Respect could sometimes be bought with wealth, but wealth was rare for a retired gladiator. It could be won through heroism, but Rome refused to see gladiators as heroes. It could be demanded through force, but respect born of fear was fragile and fleeting. True respect, the kind enjoyed by senators, generals, and statesmen, was forever out of reach, and yet some tried. They married, they raised children, they built modest lives and sought to erase the past. But Rome's memory was long. A scar could not be hidden, and a name once shouted in the amphitheater could not be silenced in the streets. The stigma did not only affect the gladiator himself, it shadowed his family as well. Children of ex-gladiators often grew up marked by their father's past. They might be mocked, called names, or denied opportunities that others took for granted. Wives of ex-gladiators bore the weight of whispers, accused of marrying men of dishonor. The brand of the arena was not something easily washed away. It clung to generations. The struggle for respect became a struggle for survival, not just for the man, but for everyone tied to him. And yet, in the darkness of stigma, there was a strange kind of fascination. Romans could not help but be drawn to gladiators. They despised them, yet they could not look away. They scorned their past, yet they retold their stories. An ex-gladiator might walk into a tavern and be met with silence, only for someone to timidly ask him about the time he fought 3 opponents at once. They were outcasts who could never belong, but they were also living legends whose very presence stirred curiosity and fear. It was a double-edged sword, cutting both ways, and the gladiator had no choice but to live with its edge pressed against his throat. Some embraced the role. They leaned into the image society had given them, becoming larger than life, boasting loudly of their past, turning their scars into badges of honor rather than shame. These men carved out respect in their own way, not the respect of senators or soldiers, but the rough respect of the streets, the admiration of common people who saw in them defiance, resilience, survival against all odds. But it was a fragile respect, easily lost, easily twisted back into contempt. One misstep, one drunken brawl, one accusation of theft or violence, and all the old prejudices returned with force. Others withdrew entirely, seeking quiet lives away from the city, retreating to villages or countryside where their names were not so well known. In these places, perhaps they could live without constant reminders of who they had been. Yet even there, the stigma found them. A scar on the face, a limp from an old wound, the heavy muscle of a man trained for war. These things told stories louder than words. People guessed, people whispered, and the brand of the gladiator followed like a shadow that never faded. The struggle for respect was endless. A man could fight beasts, soldiers, and fellow slaves, but the hardest enemy to defeat was memory. Rome's memory was relentless, and it defined him long after the sand had been washed from his skin. To be free was not enough. To be respected was nearly impossible. The gladiator's greatest battle was not won with sword or shield, but with the silent, daily fight to be seen as more than what he had once been. And most lost that battle, swallowed by the weight of stigma that no amount of courage could ever overcome. So the question lingers: if you had survived the arena, if you had walked free with the rudies in your hand, could you endure the unending whispers, the suspicious glances, the walls of society that barred you from honor? Could you hold your head high when every scar was a reminder, not of bravery, but of shame in the eyes of others? Could you wrestle respect from a world determined never to give it to you? Or would you crumble, not under the sword of an opponent, but under the invisible chains of stigma that bound you tighter than any manacles ever did? The rudies in your hand felt light, almost too light, compared to the swords and spears that had once decided your fate. The crowd had cheered, the sponsor had smiled, and you had walked out through the gates of the amphitheater as a free man. But when the echo of applause faded, a far more pressing question rose to the surface. What now? Freedom was sweet, yes, but freedom also meant hunger. In the arena, you had been fed, housed, clothed, even if it was only to keep you alive long enough to fight again. Outside those walls, nothing was guaranteed. The myth of retirement was that a gladiator walked away with wealth and comfort, rewarded for years of spilling blood. The truth was much harsher. Rome did not provide pensions, and most gladiators were far from rich when they laid down their weapons. Survival, for many, became the most brutal fight of all. Some prize money did exist. Victorious gladiators were often given rewards after successful matches, coins, gifts, sometimes even a purse heavy enough to buy temporary luxury. Champions of the arena, men who won again and again, could accumulate wealth over the years. Certain names were so famous that Romans would pay to see them in action, and their owners rewarded them generously, knowing their fame drew in larger crowds and bigger profits. But here was the cruel twist. Most of that money never stayed with the fighter. Gladiators were property, and property owed everything to its master. The rewards often went first to the lanesta, the trainer and owner who managed the gladiator school. A portion might be given to the fighter, but the rest filled the coffers of those who profited from their blood. For the average gladiator, a single purse of coins could vanish quickly. Some spent it immediately, knowing that death might claim them tomorrow. A night of wine, a feast, a few hours in the company of admirers, these fleeting pleasures were worth more than saving for a future that might never come. Others tried to hold on to what they earned, but without education or guidance, managing money was nearly impossible. A gladiator knew how to fight, not how to trade, negotiate, or invest. Gold slipped through their fingers like water, and when freedom finally came, many found their hands empty. And so the question remains, did retired gladiators get paid? The blunt answer is no. Rome offered no retirement plan, no pension, no guaranteed land or livelihood. The wooden sword freed the body, but it came with nothing else. Whatever wealth a gladiator left with was entirely dependent on his own victories, the generosity of patrons, and his ability to resist the temptations of Rome's pleasures. Few succeeded. The lucky ones, those rare fighters who became stars of the amphitheater, had enough to build a life beyond the sand. They opened taverns or inns, places where patrons flocked not only for food and drink, but for the novelty of being served by a former champion. Their names still carried weight, and they used it to draw business. Some even bought property, modest villas outside the city where they could live quietly, their scars hidden beneath tunics as they pretended to be ordinary men. A handful found wealthy patrons willing to continue supporting them, treating them like exotic pets to be displayed at banquets, providing them with housing and gifts in exchange for stories of the arena. But these were exceptions. For every gladiator who retired comfortably, dozens more walked into poverty. Their bodies, battered from years of combat, could not endure heavy labor. Their reputation closed the doors of respectable work. What employer wanted a man known for killing? What craftsman wanted to share his workshop with someone whose hands had held swords, not chisels? They drifted instead toward the only work left to them, violence. Hired as guards for shady merchants, muscle for gangs, or mercenaries in distant provinces, their lives after freedom were often just as dangerous as their lives in chains. The difference was that now, if they fell, no crowd would roar their names. The bitter irony was that some gladiators chose to return to the arena voluntarily, not as slaves, but as free men. They signed contracts to fight again, lured by the promise of coin and the chance to relive the fleeting glory that freedom had stolen from them. To fight again as a volunteer was shameful in the eyes of respectable Romans, but for the ex-gladiator it was survival. The sand might kill them, but at least it fed them too. Others took different paths. Some became trainers, selling their knowledge to new recruits. Their scars became lessons, their limp a warning of what awaited careless fighters. Trainers were often paid decently, and though the work kept them tied to the arena, it offered stability. A few managed to climb higher, running entire schools, turning their brutality into business. But this required connections, wealth, and luck, things most ex-gladiators lacked. Prize money could also come from patrons. Wealthy Romans sometimes took a liking to particular fighters, sponsoring their retirement, gifting them small amounts of money, or even providing land. Yet patronage was unpredictable and dangerous. A gladiator's freedom depended on the whim of another, and what was given today could be taken tomorrow. To rely on patronage was to remain, in some sense, a servant, never truly free. So did retired gladiators live in wealth? The stories Rome told made it seem so. Poems spoke of champions courted by noble women. Songs told of men who left the sand rich and adored. Plays imagined ex-gladiators living in luxury. But these were fantasies, written to amuse, not to reflect reality. The truth was that most walked into freedom with nothing more than scars and memories. They survived as best they could, scraping together coins from odd jobs, selling their strength, or begging in the streets. The wooden sword might grant a man liberty, but liberty did not buy bread. And here lies the cruelest truth of all. In the arena, at least the gladiator knew his place. He knew his schedule, his meals, his battles, the rules of life and death. Outside, freedom was chaos. Hunger gnawed at his belly. Poverty chased him down alleys. Respect was denied him at every turn. He had risked his life for Rome, entertained thousands, and survived when countless others had fallen. And yet, when the sand was swept clean and the gates were closed, Rome gave him nothing in return. Would you survive in such a world? Imagine yourself holding the Rudies, your body broken, your pockets empty, the crowd's cheers still ringing, but already fading. You step into the city, hoping for peace, hoping for reward. But the baker will not hire you, the farmer shakes his head, the soldier laughs at the idea of you joining his ranks. You are free, yes, but freedom tastes like hunger. Would you find a way to turn your fame into survival? Would you beg, steal, kill, or crawl back into the arena for one more fight? Or would you vanish into Rome's endless streets, just another scarred shadow swallowed by poverty? The answer was different for every man, but the question was always the same. Did retired gladiators get paid? No, they got nothing but their lives, and for most, even that was not enough. The wooden sword in a retired gladiator's hand symbolized freedom, but it rarely symbolized security. The streets of Rome were merciless to men who bore scars instead of trades, muscles instead of letters, and reputations that frightened more than they inspired. Yet among the narrow paths that lay before an ex-gladiator, there was one route that offered a glimmer of stability: the training schools. For many, the only way to turn survival into something resembling a career was to return to the very places that had once broken them, this time not as students, but as teachers. Gladiator schools, or ludi, were the factories of Rome's most brutal form of entertainment. Behind their high walls and guarded gates, men from every corner of the empire trained, sweated, and bled to prepare for spectacles that would either crown them as idols or bury them in the sand. These schools were run with discipline sharper than any sword, overseen by Lannister managers whose wealth and influence rested on the bodies of the fighters they owned. Inside, everything was calculated: the diet to fatten or strengthen, the drills to harden reflexes, the punishments to instill obedience. A man entered the ludus as property, and most left only for the grave or the arena floor. Yet for a rare few who survived long enough to earn freedom, the ludus could become something else, a place of return, a source of income, and a second life as an instructor. The irony was bitter. To escape the chains of the school, only to willingly step back inside its walls, was to accept that a gladiator could never truly sever ties with the world that had defined him. But for many, it was the only choice. Life as a trainer carried its own hardships, but it also brought a measure of dignity. In the streets, a retired gladiator might be shunned, whispered about, dismissed as a beast in human form. In the ludus, however, his scars were not shameful, but honorable. His limp a badge of survival, his broken nose proof that he had faced the fury of the sand and lived. Recruits looked upon him with awe, knowing he had stood where they now stood, knowing he had done what they feared they could not. Among the young and desperate, he was no longer an outcast, but a master. The role of the trainer was demanding. It was not enough to bark orders or swing a stick at recruits. The retired gladiator had to become strategist, motivator, disciplinarian, and sometimes even father figure. He taught men how to grip their weapons, how to read an opponent's eyes, how to pace themselves so exhaustion did not consume them before the final blow. He drilled them in formations, forced them to practice until muscle memory replaced hesitation, and reminded them daily that hesitation was death. Every scar on his body was a lesson, every story of survival a warning. See this shoulder? He might say, pointing to a deep cut that never healed properly. That was hesitation. And yet, as he instructed others, he relived his own past. Each clang of wooden swords in the courtyard, each grunt of effort, each cry of pain from a failed block brought him back to the days when he was one of them. He remembered the endless drills, the hunger, the fear of being chosen for a match that might be his last. Teaching was a form of survival, but it was also a form of entrapment, chaining him forever to the cycle of blood he had once dreamed of escaping. Still, the training schools offered advantages no street or tavern could provide. Trainers were paid not extravagantly, but steadily. They had food, shelter, and a place within the structure of the ludus. For a man cast adrift by society, this stability was precious. It meant no nights begging in alleys, no desperate search for odd work, no slow starvation. It also meant power, limited though it was. Within the walls, his word carried weight. Young gladiators might resent his orders, but they obeyed because they knew he embodied the future they either dreaded or desired. He had walked through death and emerged alive. In their eyes, that gave him authority no lanista could match. The path from fighter to teacher also offered another subtle reward legacy. A gladiator's fame was fleeting, but a trainer could shape generations of fighters. His techniques, his strategies, his lessons lived on through the men he prepared. Some of those men might become champions themselves, carrying echoes of their teacher into the sand. In this way, a retired gladiator found a kind of immortality, not in statues or poems, but in the movements of those who survived because of his instruction. But the life of a trainer was not free of shadows. To teach others to fight was to sentence them to the same cycle of pain he had endured. Many trainers felt guilt as they watched their students march into the arena, knowing full well that some would never return. They had taught them to fight, but they could not teach them to survive fate. Each death was a reminder that he was feeding the same machine that had nearly destroyed him. For some, this guilt was unbearable, but for others, it was softened by the cold reality of survival. Better them than him. Some trainers gained notoriety of their own. The best could command higher pay, sought after by Lannister, who wanted their fighters to win more often. A skilled trainer could rise to oversee entire schools, managing dozens of recruits, organizing drills, and shaping champions. In these rare cases, an ex-gladiator could build a modest fortune, enough to secure a comfortable life when age finally stripped away his strength. Yet these men were few, and their power always remained dependent on the whims of those above them. No matter how skilled a trainer became, he was still, in the eyes of Rome's elite, just another man tied to the blood of the arena. For many, the greatest torment of becoming a trainer was psychological. Every morning, as they walked through the gates of the school, they were confronted with the reality that they had never truly left. The walls that once imprisoned them now sheltered them. The drills that once exhausted them now echoed from their own commands. The arena's shadow loomed just as dark, only now they were safe from its direct glare, at least until they grew too old or too useless for even training. Freedom had brought them back into the cycle, and in some ways it was worse than chains. And yet the alternative was harsher. To starve in the streets, to beg for coin, to be mocked and shunned by society. These fates were worse than returning to the ludus. At least in the training schools, a man had purpose. He was not just surviving. He was shaping others, commanding respect within those walls, and finding a measure of dignity that the outside world refused him. So could you walk back into the school that had once owned you? Could you spend your days drilling young men, watching them march toward their deaths, knowing that you were both saving and condemning them? Could you accept that your freedom meant returning to the same world you once dreamed of escaping, but this time as a cog in the very machine you despised? For many ex-gladiators, the answer was yes, because the alternative was hunger. Freedom was precious, but survival was everything. This was the transformation from fighter to teacher, not a rebirth, not a clean break, but a compromise with fate. A man traded the roar of the crowd for the shouts of recruits, traded the edge of a sword for the weight of authority, traded the fleeting glory of combat for the quiet, weary respect of instruction. It was not the life he imagined, but it was life nonetheless. And in the cruel world of Rome, that was more than most could ever hope for. Freedom was meant to feel like a rebirth, but for the gladiator who walked away from the sand, it often felt more like dragging a broken body into a world that had no use for it. To outsiders, scars were curiosity's marks to whisper about in taverns, proof of violent spectacles once cheered by thousands. But to the man who bore them, every scar was a memory of pain, every crooked bone a reminder that he had traded pieces of his body for survival. Life after the arena was not simply a battle for respect or money. It was a battle against his own flesh, against wounds that never healed, and injuries that haunted him long after the crowd's applause had faded. The human body is not designed to endure years of brutal combat. Every match in the arena took its toll, even on those who managed to leave victorious. Broken ribs healed crooked, leaving men gasping for breath after a short climb up a hill. Dislocated shoulders stiffened over time, limiting the reach of a sword arm. Knees shattered in falls or crushed beneath shields turned every step into agony. Concussions, though unnamed in Rome, left men confused, forgetful, prone to rages or sudden collapses. These wounds did not vanish when the rudis was placed in their hand. They followed them like invisible chains, tightening with age. Imagine waking each morning with the weight of your own body as your enemy. Your back screams from old fractures. Your hands ache so badly you can barely hold a cup, though once you held a sword with deadly precision. Every step reminds you of the arena, every movement limited by damage carved into your muscles and bones. Freedom is bitter when even walking to the market feels like another battle. Some gladiators, still young in years, carried bodies older than men twice their age. The years of punishment had stolen their strength long before time could. The most visible reminders were the scars, deep gashes across arms and legs, jagged lines carved into faces. Puckered wounds where blades or teeth had pierced flesh, these were badges of survival to those who had fought beside them. But to Roman citizens, they were grotesque. People stared, some in awe, others in disgust. A nobleman's scar, won in battle for the legions, was honorable. A gladiator's scar was shameful, proof of degradation and violence for amusement. Thus, the very marks that testified to his endurance became symbols of disgrace in the eyes of society. But scars were not only skin deep. Internal wounds, invisible to the eye, plagued ex-gladiators daily. Blows to the head left many with dizziness, blurred vision, and sudden blackouts. Sword thrusts that had narrowly missed organs often left behind infections or internal damage that slowly eroded their health. Many suffered from what we would now call post-traumatic shock. They flinched at loud noises, woke in the night drenched in sweat, or dreamed of the faces of men they had killed. Rome had no words for these afflictions, no treatments, no understanding. A retired gladiator was expected to endure his torments silently, just as he had endured them in the arena. The pain also shaped their futures. Work became nearly impossible for those crippled by their injuries. Farming demanded strong backs and steady hands. Craftsmanship required precision and endurance. Even guarding the doors of wealthy patrons was difficult when every step brought a limp. Every swing of a club risked reopening an old wound. Those who could not find work often turned to begging, displaying their scars in the hopes that pity might bring them a few coins. In this way, the body that had once earned the crowd's applause became a spectacle again, but this time in the cruel theater of survival. Some gladiators sought relief in drink, numbing their pain with wine until their days blurred together. Others turned to herbs and crude medicines, but these offered little more than temporary comfort. Bones that had healed poorly could not be straightened. Missing fingers could not be replaced. Eyes blinded by sand and steel could not be restored. Every solution was a patch, never a cure. And so they endured year after year, trapped within bodies that betrayed them. And yet, in the midst of suffering, some found strange pride in their scars. Among their fellow ex-gladiators, these marks were stories, each one a testament to survival. This scar, a man might say, tracing the jagged line across his thigh, was from the day I faced 2 Thracians at once. Another would point to a shattered hand and laugh. The lion got me there, but I broke its jaw before they dragged it away. In these circles, pain became proof of strength. Scars became symbols of defiance. They had faced death and lived, and no one could take that away. Within this brotherhood of the scarred, they found the respect denied them by society. But outside those circles, the struggle remained brutal. Wives grew weary of tending to broken husbands who could no longer provide. Children grew up watching fathers bent and crippled, admired by no one, feared by many. The gladiator's body, once his greatest weapon, became his heaviest burden. Even in freedom, he was shackled to the arena by the simple truth that his flesh had been carved by it. There were rare stories of gladiators who turned their injuries into opportunity. Some became healers themselves, using their knowledge of wounds to treat others. They could recognize a fracture, stitch a gash, set a bone, not from books, but from experience. Their services were valued in certain communities, though never respected by the elite. Others used their battered bodies as lessons, becoming trainers who warned recruits of the dangers of poor technique, demonstrating on themselves what happened when a man left his guard open. Their pain, in this way, gained purpose. But these were exceptions. For most, the body was an unending punishment, a constant reminder that freedom did not erase the past. Each scar whispered the same truth. The arena never let go. It lived in their flesh, in their bones, in their daily struggle to move, breathe, and exist. So imagine again you have survived the arena. You hold your rudies, step into freedom, and find yourself crippled by the very battles that won you life. Your scars are the first thing people see, your limp the first thing they notice, your trembling hands the first they mock. Could you endure the humiliation of being treated as less than a man, not because you lost, but because you survived too long? Could you bear the weight of every wound as it drags you down day by day? Would you see your scars as a crown or a curse? For the gladiator, there was no escape. The battles ended, but the body remembered. And in that memory, carved in flesh and bone, lay the cruelest truth of all. Freedom was never free, not when every breath carried the cost of survival. To survive the arena was a miracle. To step out alive with the wooden sword of freedom in hand was a triumph most gladiators never lived to see. Yet for many, that triumph soon soured into desperation. The cheers faded, the patrons drifted away, and the harsh truth of Roman society closed in like the bars of a cage. Freedom was not the paradise imagined by men behind the walls of the ludus. It was hunger, it was rejection, it was loneliness. And so, in a bitter twist, some gladiators found themselves drawn back into the very life they had fought so hard to escape. Poverty was relentless, and for many, it was worse than the arena itself. At first, the idea of returning seemed unthinkable. A freed gladiator had suffered years of blood and pain to earn his liberty. Why would he ever willingly go back to the sand? But as days turned into weeks and the few coins he had saved slipped away, the walls of reality closed in. Work was scarce, especially for men with broken bodies and violent reputations. Respectable trades shunned them. Fields required backs unbroken by years of combat. Shops required hands that had not been mangled by swords, and the Roman elite preferred not to hire men whose faces carried the stigma of the arena. Even those who found work earned so little that survival was barely possible. Hunger gnawed at them, debts piled up, and the streets grew colder. And then came the whispers, a lanista offering coin for a few more fights, a patron promising wealth if the old champion returned to the amphitheater, even just for one grand appearance. The arena had always been cruel, but it had also been predictable. Fight, bleed, maybe win, maybe die. Poverty was far less merciful. It killed slowly, humiliatingly, stripping a man of dignity, piece by piece. To some, the risk of dying quickly under the roar of the crowd seemed preferable to wasting away in silence. For many, the decision was not even about glory, but survival. A gladiator might look at his starving children, his sick wife, and realize that the only skill he possessed, the only one Rome would pay for, was killing. And so he signed the contract, stepping once again into the dust and the blood. This time he was not a slave, but a volunteer. Yet the chains of necessity bound him tighter than any iron ever could. The Roman people, for their part, loved a returning gladiator. The drama of it thrilled them, the old champion, scarred and weary, stepping back into the sand for one last battle. The crowd would roar louder than ever, showering him with cheers, coins, and praise. In those moments it was almost as if poverty had vanished, as if freedom had truly brought him glory. But once the fight ended, once the blood was washed away, he returned to the same reality. A few coins in his hand, pain in his body, and nothing lasting to show for it. Some men became trapped in this cycle, returning again and again to the arena, each time hoping it would be the last. A victory might buy them a few months of food, a few nights of shelter, but when the coins ran out, desperation returned. They became veterans of survival, caught between two worlds, neither of which wanted them. The arena chewed them up slowly, and the streets spat them out entirely. Others saw returning as a chance to reclaim lost fame. For a brief moment, they were remembered again. Crowds shouted their names. Poets mentioned them in verses. Tavern-goers told stories of their exploits. Fame was addictive, and for men who had lived their entire lives in the spotlight of the amphitheater, obscurity was unbearable. Poverty stripped away not only food, but identity. Returning to the arena gave them both, even if only temporarily. But the costs were high. Returning meant facing younger, stronger fighters, men in their prime with everything to prove. The ex-gladiator carried scars, stiff joints, and slower reflexes. The crowd loved the spectacle of an aging veteran facing a brutal challenge, but for the fighter, it often meant death. Many who returned never walked out again. Their attempt to escape poverty ended in the sand, their names swallowed by the roar of a crowd that would cheer just as loudly for the next man tomorrow. For some, poverty pushed them not back into the arena, but into darker paths. Banditry, extortion, mercenary work, these became alternatives to starvation. But these paths were just as dangerous, and without the controlled spectacle of the amphitheater, death was often quicker and less glorious. Compared to the chaos of crime, the arena almost seemed safe. At least there, a man could gamble for coin and recognition. The cycle of poverty revealed the harsh truth about Rome's entertainment machine. Gladiators were not celebrated heroes who retired into luxury. They were expendable bodies, used until broken, then discarded. Rome did not care for them once the crowd's appetite had been satisfied. Their fame was fleeting, their rewards meager, and their freedom often worse than their captivity. Poverty was the silent executioner, killing more gladiators after the arena than swords ever did within it. Imagine yourself in their place. You have survived years of battles, won your freedom, and now stand in the streets of Rome with nothing but scars and hunger. A man approaches, offering coin to fight again, just one more time. Your body aches, but your children cry with hunger. Your pride tells you to refuse, but your stomach tells you to accept. Could you resist? Could you endure the slow humiliation of poverty? Or would you step back into the sand, gambling your life once more for the chance to eat? This was the cruel paradox of freedom for the gladiator. It was liberation, yes, but also abandonment. Rome gave them nothing when they left the arena, and poverty gave them no choice but to return. The risk of death was familiar, almost comforting, compared to the slow torture of hunger. And so many gladiators discovered that their hardest fight was not for freedom, but for survival after it. Freedom did not always mean obscurity. For most gladiators, retirement was a struggle against poverty, hunger, and a society that saw them as tainted. But for a rare few, those whose names echoed through the taverns of Rome and whose victories burned into the memory of the crowd, retirement opened the door to an entirely different kind of life. They were not beggars on the street or crippled veterans limping through alleys. They were superstars, men whose fame outlasted the blood and sand of the arena. To these few, freedom meant stepping out of the amphitheater, not into silence, but into the applause of a city that could not stop speaking their names. Gladiators were, in many ways, the celebrities of the ancient world. Rome loved spectacle, and the men who provided it were unforgettable. The poet Juvenal once described the frenzy of women swooning over fighters, admiring their muscles, their scars, their very aura of danger. Aristocrats who might never invite a gladiator to dinner in polite company nonetheless whispered about them in private, thrilled by the stories of their daring. Merchants sold small figurines modeled after famous fighters. Graffiti scrawled on walls celebrated their victories, and the names of champions were etched into the collective memory of the people. To become a star in the arena was to achieve immortality while still alive. For the rare fighter who retired with this level of fame, life after the sand could be shockingly glamorous. Some were courted by wealthy patrons who showered them with gifts, offering them places at banquets, even arranging marriages into respectable families. Though gladiators were technically in fame's dishonorable in Roman law, the sheer magnetism of celebrity sometimes broke through these barriers. A man who had thrilled the Colosseum with a dozen victories might find himself dining at the table of a senator, entertained not as an equal, but as a prized guest whose very presence added luster to the event. Money also flowed more easily for these stars. Whereas the average ex-gladiator struggled to find work, the superstar could command payment for appearances, for training the sons of wealthy families, even for simply allowing his name to be used in advertisements for taverns or markets. Their images appeared on painted signs, their likenesses drawn in mosaics or crude carvings. To see such a face meant excitement, danger, and entertainment, the very qualities Romans adored. Some even leveraged their fame into business, opening inns, bathhouses, or schools that thrived simply because people wanted to be near a living legend. The fame of these men could blur the line between spectacle and politics. A retired gladiator who had once been adored by tens of thousands held influence that even senators envied. Crowds could be stirred by the sight of a hero from the arena, and politicians understood this power. Some gladiators were courted by ambitious men who hoped to borrow their charisma for public games or festivals. Their presence at events guaranteed attention, and in a city where the crowd's voice often swayed decisions, such influence was valuable. In this way, the gladiator, who had once been chained, became, in retirement, a subtle player in Rome's endless games of power. But celebrity came with its own dangers. Fame was intoxicating, but it was also fragile. A single scandal could ruin a man's reputation, and Romans were quick to turn adoration into mockery. Some retired fighters squandered their fame in drunkenness and arrogance, strutting through the streets as if they were kings, only to be brought low when the novelty of their glory faded. Others were used by patrons for their own amusement, paraded like exotic pets, their fame exploited without true respect. The very society that cheered them also despised them, and the line between celebration and ridicule was razor thin. Yet for all these risks, the life of the gladiator superstar was enviable compared to the poverty of most ex-fighters. Imagine walking into a tavern, the crowd rising to greet you, mugs of wine thrust into your hand, strangers calling out your victories as if they had been their own. Imagine women leaning in to touch the scars that once horrified others, now seen as marks of irresistible danger. Imagine merchants offering you free meals, free clothes, just for the chance to say their goods were chosen by the famous champion of the Colosseum. This was not obscurity. This was the second life, the afterglow of survival turned into a spotlight that could burn as brightly as the sun. Some gladiators even crossed into legend. Their names were whispered for generations, their stories exaggerated until they became half myth. Tales of fighters who defeated impossible odds, who retired undefeated, who walked away from Rome itself to live in hidden luxury became the stuff of fantasy. For every man who died nameless in the dust, there was a story of one who defied fate and lived as a hero. These stories inspired others, gave hope to the fighters still locked in schools, and thrilled the public who longed for heroes larger than life. But could you live as such a man? Could you bear the constant attention, the eyes of strangers always watching, the whispers that turned your victories into gossip? Would you revel in the luxury, the gifts, the adoration? Or would you feel the shadow of the arena in every cheer, every request for a story? Fame was a double-edged sword. It brought wealth and recognition, but it also chained a man forever to his past. He could never escape being the gladiator. Even in freedom, even in celebrity, he remained defined by the blood he had shed. And yet, for many, it was enough. To live as a superstar was to beat the odds not once, but twice. First by surviving the arena, and second by surviving freedom without being swallowed by poverty. It was the rarest of fates, but for those who achieved it, it was intoxicating. Rome was a city that adored spectacle, and for the retired gladiator who became a celebrity, life after the sand was still a stage only now. He could choose how to play his role. So imagine yourself once more. You walk out of the arena, the rudies in your hand, and instead of silence, you find yourself surrounded by cheers that follow you into the streets, into the markets, into every corner of the city. Your name is carved into walls, sung in taverns, whispered by admirers. You are no longer a slave, no longer a fighter. You are a legend. Would you thrive in such a spotlight? Would you build wealth and power, or would you lose yourself in the intoxicating haze of fame? For most gladiators, retirement was a struggle against hunger. But for the few who became superstars of Rome, retirement was a second act, sometimes brighter than the first. They lived not as outcasts, but as icons, their scars transformed from shame into symbols of glory. In their lives, we see not just survival, but triumph over a world that rarely allowed men like them to win. A gladiator's sword could win freedom, But once he stepped into retirement, survival depended on something far more subtle: connections. In Rome, the empire of patronage, power flowed not through blood alone, but through friendship, obligation, and influence. For an ex-gladiator whose reputation was bound to the roar of the arena, the path to stability often ran through the hands of powerful men. To have the favor of a senator, a wealthy merchant, or even an ambitious officer meant food, protection, and opportunity. To make the wrong enemy meant ruin, exile, or worse. In freedom, politics replaced steel, and navigating this new battlefield could be just as deadly. The arena was never just a sport. Behind every match lay the shadow of Roman politics. Gladiatorial games were funded by politicians eager to win public favor, by emperors seeking to distract restless crowds, and by wealthy citizens eager to flaunt their status. The men who fought were pawns in a larger spectacle, symbols of generosity for their sponsors. When a gladiator became famous, he became more than entertainment. He became political currency. His victories reflected glory onto those who funded the games, and his popularity could sway the mood of a crowd. The most successful fighters, therefore, often left the arena with powerful eyes still upon them. For some ex-gladiators, this attention translated into patronage. A wealthy senator might employ a retired champion as a bodyguard, not only for protection but for prestige. To walk into the Forum flanked by a former star of the Colosseum was a statement of wealth and influence, a living trophy that commanded respect. Others were hired as trainers, brought into elite households to drill young aristocrats in the arts of combat. These roles provided steady income, but more importantly, they offered proximity to power. In Rome, proximity meant survival. Yet patronage was a double-edged sword. To be tied to a powerful man was to share his fortunes, for better or worse. If a senator fell from grace, his gladiator-turned protege might be dragged down with him. Enemies of the patron could become enemies of the fighter, regardless of personal choice. In this way, the politics of Rome entangled ex-gladiators in webs as dangerous as any arena net. Their survival depended not just on their own skill, but on the shifting tides of ambition among Rome's elite. Some retired gladiators leveraged their fame with cunning. They became clients in the vast system of Roman patronage, aligning themselves with men who could offer protection in exchange for loyalty. In return, they lent their voices, their presence, even their intimidating reputations to public gatherings. The crowd that once cheered them in the amphitheater might now see them standing beside a politician, silently endorsing his power. For the ambitious ex-gladiator, this role could elevate him above poverty, turning him into a figure of real influence. But politics was never safe. Rome was a city where rivals plotted constantly, where alliances shifted overnight, and where loyalty was as fragile as glass. An ex-gladiator tied too closely to one faction could find himself targeted by another. A man who had once faced death with a sword now faced it through whispers, accusations, and betrayals. Poison replaced steel, exile replaced defeat, and survival depended on navigating treachery as carefully as one had once parried blows. The danger was compounded by envy. To the Roman elite, gladiators were still infame-tainted men, dishonorable in the eyes of the law. Their rise through patronage provoked resentment. Senators mocked them as brutes elevated beyond their station. Aristocrats whispered about their lowly origins. Rivals plotted to strip them of influence. The same scars that made them admired by the masses made them despised by those in power. To balance between public adoration and elite disdain was to walk a tightrope, one slip away from disaster. Enemies could emerge from other directions as well. A rival gladiator still in the arena might resent the fame and patronage of a retired champion, stirring trouble to undermine him. Old debts from before freedom might resurface, creditors demanding payment now that the fighter was tied to wealth. Even among their fellow ex-gladiators, jealousy brewed. Those who languished in poverty often looked upon the politically connected with bitterness, seeing in them not brothers but opportunists who had abandoned the bond of suffering. Yet despite the dangers, politics and patronage offered something no other path could: power. A gladiator who aligned himself wisely could become untouchable. He might own property, command respect, even influence decisions in the Senate through his patron's favor. Some whispered that ex-gladiators even became enforcers in political struggles, their presence at rallies or riots a physical reminder of their violent past. The skills that once thrilled the arena now secured victories in the streets. Imagine yourself as one of these men. You have survived the sand, earned freedom, and now stand at the crossroads of survival. A wealthy senator offers you protection, a home, steady income, and influence, so long as you pledge loyalty to him. Do you accept knowing that his enemies will become your own? Do you dare to step into politics, where battles are fought not with swords but with daggers in the dark? Could you resist the temptation of power, or would you gamble your fragile freedom for a place at the table of Rome's elite? For some, the gamble paid off. They lived in relative luxury, shielded from poverty, respected by the masses, feared by their enemies. For others, the gamble ended in ruin. They were exiled, executed, or discarded when their patrons no longer needed them. Politics, like the arena, offered glory but demanded blood. And just as in the arena, few survived for long. The gladiator's retirement was never simple. To live quietly was to risk poverty. To seek patronage was to risk betrayal. Each path carried danger. Each choice demanded courage. In freedom, as in the sand, survival belonged not to the strongest, but to the most cunning. The sword had won them life. Now, politics decided whether that life was worth living. Freedom was supposed to mean an end to bloodshed. When a gladiator stepped out of the arena with his rudies, the wooden sword of liberty, he should have been walking into safety, into peace, into the quiet life denied him for so long. Yet the shadows of his past never loosened their grip. A man who had once killed for spectacle could not simply fade into obscurity. His enemies remembered, his rivals still thirsted for revenge, and even strangers who had seen him in the sand carried opinions of him, some in admiration, many in hatred. For an ex-gladiator, death continued to stalk him long after the crowd's roar had faded. The arena was a forge of grudges. Fighters who survived long enough to gain fame often collected enemies just as easily as they collected scars. Fellow gladiators, beaten and humiliated before the crowd, nursed resentment against the man who had defeated them. Trainers and lanistei, slighted or disobeyed, remembered. Even spectators could become enemies' men who had bet heavily against the champion and lost fortunes, or those who despised a gladiator's rise to fame, seeing it as an insult to noble Roman values. To walk free into Rome was to walk among men who might see your survival not as triumph but as insult. For many retired gladiators, the threat of assassination was real. Revenge did not end at the arena's gate. Rivals who had been defeated but not killed sometimes returned, seeking to restore their honor with blood. Some lurked in the taverns, watching for a chance to strike when the former champion grew drunk. Others waited in alleys, blades hidden, determined to cut down the man who had stolen their glory. The streets of Rome were as dangerous as the amphitheater. Only the rules were looser and the audience absent. Death came quietly now, in shadows instead of sand. Old debts also drew enemies. Many gladiators had been slaves, but those who had been free volunteers often carried financial or personal obligations. A freed fighter who had once borrowed coin to gamble, or who had angered a creditor with arrogance, found those debts waiting when he stepped into retirement. Rome was merciless in matters of money. A man who could not pay was not just humiliated, but ruined, stripped of what little he possessed. For an ex-gladiator whose fame made him both admired and envied, creditors pressed harder, expecting him to have hidden wealth. When the truth his poverty was revealed, anger often turned violent. Even among their own kind, retired fighters were not safe. Ex-gladiators sometimes formed brotherhoods, bound by scars and shared suffering, but jealousy lurked in these bonds. One man's fame was another's obscurity. One man's survival was another's humiliation. Fights broke out in taverns when old rivals crossed paths, their grudges reignited by wine and memory. For the crowd, these brawls were entertainment. For the fighters, they were deadly. What began as insults could end with daggers, and the sand of the arena was replaced by the dirt of an alley. Beyond personal enemies, the shadow of the law loomed as well. Though gladiators thrilled the masses, they were legally infames, men marked with dishonor. Their survival outside the arena did not erase this status. Judges, officials, and guards viewed them with suspicion. A retired gladiator accused of violence, whether guilty or not, was often condemned swiftly, his past serving as proof of guilt in the eyes of the law. Thus, enemies did not even need to lift a blade. A false accusation could destroy a man just as thoroughly as a sword. The constant threat of violence shaped the way ex-gladiators lived. Many carried weapons, even in freedom, unwilling to walk unarmed through Rome's twisting streets. Some hired themselves out as guards, reasoning that if death was inevitable, they might as well be paid for it. Others withdrew from public life entirely, hiding their identities, avoiding the taverns and markets where recognition could lead to confrontation. Yet isolation carried its own torment, for a man who lived in the shadows was little better than a prisoner once again. And then there were the ghosts. Every gladiator had killed. Faces of the fallen haunted their dreams, shadows of men who had bled beneath their blades. Whether imagined or real, some felt pursued by these dead. They saw them in crowds, heard their voices in the night, felt their presence in silence. For some, this torment drove them to drink, to madness, even to ending their own lives. The shadow of death was not only external, it lived within them, a poison that time could not wash away. Yet even under these threats, some ex-gladiators learned to twist the danger to their advantage. They leaned into their fearsome reputations, letting enemies tremble rather than strike. Stories of their brutality were cultivated, exaggerated, spread by whispers until no one dared challenge them. In this way, the shadow became armor, fear itself a shield. But this too was precarious. To live by reputation was to be challenged constantly, by those who sought to prove themselves stronger. The shadow of death did not retreat. It only grew darker. Imagine yourself in this world. You walk free, scars across your body, the rubies in your hand. To your face, strangers bow, whispering your name in admiration. Behind your back, knives are sharpened. In taverns, men plot against you. In alleys, rivals wait. At night, the faces of the dead rise in your dreams. Could you sleep? Could you live, knowing that every knock at the door might be an enemy? Every step in the dark might be your last? Would you trust the crowd's cheers, or would you hear in them the laughter of those who waited for your fall? For the ex-gladiator, freedom was never free of the arena. The sand had claimed many, but for those who survived, death continued its hunt in subtler, quieter ways. Enemies, rivals, creditors, the law, even their own minds, all were weapons waiting to strike. In truth, retirement did not end the battle. It merely changed the battlefield. And in this new war, there was no applause, no honor, only survival in the endless shadow of death. When the crowd thundered in the amphitheater, when the chants of thousands shook the air, the gladiator stood at the very center of Roman life. For a brief moment, he was both adored and feared, the object of fascination for men, women, and children alike. But when the fighting ended and the sand was washed clean of blood, his status in Roman society revealed itself to be far more complex. Was he an idol, a hero admired for his courage and strength? Or was he an outcast, despised as a slave, a criminal, a man tainted by dishonor? The truth was that he was both, and never fully one or the other. To understand the gladiator's place in society after his retirement, one must step into a world where fame and shame were bound together, inseparable. Rome was a society built on rigid hierarchies, and within those hierarchies, gladiators were branded with infamy, a legal and social stain that stripped them of honor. Infames were considered beneath respectable citizens, barred from political office, excluded from civic life, their word distrusted in court. To respectable Romans, gladiators were entertainment, nothing more. They were seen as men who had sold their bodies, their dignity, and their lives for the crowd's amusement. Even the greatest champions, men whose names were etched into the walls of taverns and scrawled in graffiti, carried this taint. The nobility might cheer them in the arena, but few would ever dine with them. Fewer still would treat them as equals. Yet for the common people, the story was different. To the masses who packed the Colosseum, who lived lives of toil and poverty themselves, gladiators were something more, heroes who rose from nothing to defy death. They were the living embodiment of survival against impossible odds, a spectacle of courage that ordinary men could only dream of. To these spectators, scars were badges of honor, not shame. A gladiator could walk into a tavern and be greeted with applause, offered free wine, asked to retell the story of his greatest fight again and again. He was a celebrity of the streets, idolized by those who saw in him both strength and defiance. This contradiction defined the gladiator's place in society. Among the elite, he was an outcast. Among the people, he was an idol. Among the law, he was dishonorable. Among storytellers, he was legendary. Retirement did not erase this paradox, it magnified it. A freed gladiator carried both the admiration of the crowd and the scorn of the powerful wherever he went. Marriage revealed the tension most clearly. Roman aristocrats sneered at women who swooned over gladiators, mocking them for being enthralled by men of such low status. Yet many women, especially those from the wealthier classes, were drawn irresistibly to these figures. The danger, the scars, the raw vitality of men who had fought wild beasts and enemies in front of thousands gave them an allure that poets mocked but never denied. Affairs between women of status and gladiators were whispered about endlessly, sometimes even leading to scandal. But while a woman might admire or even love a gladiator, marrying him was another matter entirely. The stigma of infamia lingered, and most families would rather disown a daughter than see her joined to one once marked by the sand. Thus, even in intimacy, the gladiator was both idolized and shunned. Economically, the contradictions were just as sharp. A retired fighter might earn a living as a guard, a trainer, or a showpiece for a patron, but he would rarely be accepted into the respectable trades of Rome. Merchants, craftsmen, and landowners looked down on him, unwilling to allow one tainted by blood sport to rise into their circles. And yet, the same merchants might use his name or image to attract customers, hanging paintings or carvings of famous gladiators to draw in crowds. His likeness was valuable, even if his person was despised. He was commodified, celebrated in symbol, but rejected in reality. The tension extended even into religion and ritual life. Gladiators, being infames, were barred from certain sacred rites and excluded from civic honors. But paradoxically, their images often appeared in funerary art and local shrines, symbols of strength, courage, and endurance. Families of the lower classes, in particular, honored gladiators as exemplars of bravery, while the elite dismissed them as dishonorable. Again and again, the gladiator was caught between two worlds, idolized as a symbol, rejected as a man. Even in death, this contradiction persisted. Wealthy patrons sometimes erected grand tombs for famous gladiators, monuments decorated with carvings of their battles, inscriptions praising their courage. Passers-by could marvel at these memorials, admiring the fighter's life. Yet, to the elite, these tombs were reminders of decadence, of a society obsessed with blood and spectacle. They sneered at the idea that a gladiator could be remembered as a hero. To them he remained an outcast, unworthy of true respect. For the gladiator himself, the question of identity was constant. Was he truly free in retirement or still bound by the stigma of his past? Did he walk through the streets as a man admired by the crowd, or as a man despised by the powerful? Did he see his scars as a crown or a curse? Many wrestled with this inner conflict, never finding peace. Some embraced their role as idols of the people, reveling in the admiration of the masses. Others grew bitter, resenting a world that praised them one day and spat on them the next. Imagine yourself in their place. You step out of the arena, cheered by thousands, only to find that the Senate despises you, that the law mistrusts you, that the wealthy sneer at you. Yet when you walk into a tavern, the common people rise, offering you drink, asking for stories. You are both less than a man and more than a man, cursed and blessed, scorned and worshipped. Could you live with such contradictions? Could you endure being an idol in one moment and an outcast in the next? This was the gladiator's paradox. In the Colosseum, he was larger than life. In the streets, he was both admired and despised. In freedom, he remained chained to the very identity he had fought to escape. His place in society was never stable, never secure. He was both idol and outcast, and he would be remembered as both for as long as Rome endured. When a gladiator retired from the arena, he did not leave behind the wounds carved into his flesh. Every scar told a story, but every scar also carried a price. Years of brutal combat left men with broken bones that never healed properly, joints ruined from strain, teeth knocked out, and deep gashes that festered into chronic pain. Even those who walked out alive often limped for the rest of their days, their bodies betraying them long before their spirits gave up. Retirement was not the beginning of rest, but the slow unraveling of a body pushed far beyond its limits. Rome admired strength, but it rarely cared for the broken. Once the applause ended, a gladiator's physical decline became a private burden. A man who once drew gasps of awe for his power might find himself unable to lift a jug of wine or walk without pain. The sharp reflexes that once kept him alive dulled into stiffness. He might wake at night with pain in his ribs, the echoes of old wounds burning, as if the sword had struck only yesterday. The arena was brutal, but it was also brief. The aftermath stretched for years, long after the crowd had forgotten his name. To dull this pain, many gladiators turned to drink. Wine was cheap and plentiful, and in taverns across Rome, ex-fighters became familiar figures, drowning their memories in cup after cup. For a man who once lived by the sharp clarity of combat, intoxication was an escape from the constant throb of scars, from the humiliation of decline, from the emptiness of silence after fame. But drink carried its own ruin. Addicted, they squandered what little coin they had, alienated those who tried to help, and stumbled deeper into poverty. For some, the tavern became their final arena, their lives ending in drunken brawls that robbed them of the dignity they had fought so hard to earn. Others turned to more dangerous vices. Gambling was common, especially among men who had once gambled daily with their lives. The thrill of chance, of winning or losing in an instant, mirrored the arena's rush. Yet the dice were as merciless as the sword. Fortune rarely smiled, and debts mounted quickly. Many ex-gladiators, already poor, sank into ruin through gambling, selling what little they possessed, sometimes even selling themselves back into service to pay what they owed. Gambling dens welcomed them eagerly, milking their hunger for risk until nothing remained. Addiction was not only to substances or chance, it was also to glory. Some men could not live without the roar of the crowd. Their bodies failed them, their lives slowed, but inside they remained fighters aching for the arena. When the applause was gone, silence became unbearable. They sought out taverns, public squares, anywhere they might be recognized, desperate for a shred of the attention they once commanded. Others returned to the arena, volunteering for fights long after they should have rested, unable to resist the pull of spectacle. For these men, addiction to fame was as deadly as any blade. Decline was not only physical or financial, but moral. Years of violence had shaped them into men for whom death was routine. Many struggled to reintegrate into ordinary life. They had lived in a world where survival demanded brutality, where hesitation meant death. To step into the marketplace or the home and be expected to behave as a normal man was disorienting. Some lashed out in anger, their tempers sharpened by years of combat. Others withdrew, haunted by the faces of the men they had slain. In both cases, the decline was as much spiritual as it was physical. Rome itself often encouraged this downfall. The city loved to see its champions rise, but it also relished their fall. Taverns buzzed with gossip about retired fighters ruined by drink or disgrace. crowds laughed at those who stumbled drunkenly in the streets, mocking the men they once cheered. The same society that had exalted them in youth discarded them in decline, eager for the next champion, the next spectacle. For many gladiators, this betrayal was as painful as the wounds of battle. And yet, decline was not inevitable for all. Some men resisted, clinging to discipline, training their bodies as best they could, refusing to drown themselves in wine or dice. But even for these few, the betrayals of age and injury could not be avoided forever. No amount of discipline could undo shattered bones or erase the effects of countless concussions. The body, once a weapon honed to perfection, became a burden. And the more glorious the fighter's youth, the harder the fall into frailty felt. Imagine yourself in their place. You have survived the arena, the sand, the blood. You walk free, but your knees ache with every step. Your back bends under the weight of scars. The cheers you once heard in your ears are gone, replaced by silence. Wine tempts you with numbness. Dice promise quick fortune. Fame whispers that you could fight one more time. Could you resist? Could you accept decline with dignity? Or would you let addiction carry you down into ruin? The betrayal of the body was the cruelest twist of all. Rome celebrated strength, but every gladiator knew strength was fleeting. No sword, no fame, no patron could stop the slow erosion of age and pain. Some endured it with grace, others collapsed into vice, but all faced it. In this there was no escape. For the gladiator, retirement was not peace. It was a new battle, waged not against another man, but against himself. And for most, it was a battle they could not win. For the gladiator who walked free from the arena, the rudies in his hand and scars across his body, survival no longer depended on the swing of a sword before thousands of spectators. Instead, it depended on the quieter, humbler skills of making a living. Rome was vast, hungry, and merciless. A man who had been trained only to fight could not simply dissolve into anonymity. To eat, to find shelter, to live another day, he had to transform the brutal lessons of the arena into something useful. For many, that meant teaching, guarding, or finding any work that would allow him to scrape together coin enough to survive. Retirement was not the end of struggle, it was the beginning of a different fight. Teaching was perhaps the most natural path. A gladiator had spent years mastering the sword, the net, the trident, or whatever weapon fate had given him. Those skills did not vanish with freedom. Wealthy Romans, obsessed with physical prowess and eager to display discipline, often hired ex-gladiators to train their sons. These boys, destined for military service or political life, were expected to embody strength as well as rhetoric, and a retired fighter offered a taste of authentic instruction. To learn from a man who had once killed in the Colosseum carried a certain prestige, a thrill of danger that appealed to both the students and their parents. For the gladiator, this work provided income, but also dignity. He became not merely a survivor, but a teacher, passing on knowledge hard-earned in blood. Others found work in the gladiator schools themselves, returning to the ludus not as fighters, but as trainers. Here they drilled new recruits in the brutal routines that had once shaped them. They barked commands, corrected stances, punished hesitation. They became part of the cycle that sustained Rome's appetite for blood. Some took pride in this, finding meaning in molding the next generation of champions. Others despised it, seeing in every student their own younger self, trapped in chains, awaiting the sand. For these men, training others was not fulfillment, but a slow erosion of their spirit. Still, the work paid, and in Rome, coin was survival. Guarding was another common path. The city teemed with merchants, nobles, and politicians who all needed protection. A former gladiator, scarred and imposing, was the perfect deterrent. To stand outside a merchant's villa, sword at his side, was to project safety through fear. Some ex-gladiators even found steady employment as bodyguards for senators or wealthy families, walking behind their patrons in the forum, eyes ever alert for thieves or assassins. In this role, their violence became respectable, their brutality polished into the sheen of professionalism. They were no longer killers in the arena, but guardians in the streets. Yet the line between the two was thin, and more than one guard found himself using the same lethal force he had once employed for spectacle, only now in service of survival. Still others fell into less formal roles. Some became enforcers for gangs or patrons, collecting debts, intimidating rivals, or keeping order in taverns. These men lived in the underbelly of Rome, their strength exploited by those with coin but no courage. The work was dangerous, the pay often meager, but for men trained only to fight, it was familiar. To them, the streets were another arena, the alleys another battleground. The difference was that here there were no cheers, no prizes, only the cold reality of survival. A rare few managed to find paths beyond violence. Some opened taverns, using their fame to attract customers eager to drink with a former champion. Others worked in bathhouses or markets, taking advantage of connections made during their careers. A handful even married into modest families and took up farming, preferring the hard but steady work of the land to the endless dangers of the city. These stories were exceptions, but they proved that survival outside the sand did not always mean a return to blood. Yet no matter what work they found, ex-gladiators carried the mark of their past. Employers saw them as dangerous, unstable, or dishonorable. Clients admired them but rarely trusted them. Neighbors watched them with both awe and suspicion. To teach, to guard, to labor, they could do all these things, but they could never erase the shadow of the arena. Their scars were permanent introductions, their reputations both a blessing and a curse. Imagine yourself in their place. You step out of the Colosseum, free at last, but empty-handed. You must eat. You must find shelter. What do you do? Do you sell your skills as a teacher, shaping boys who will one day command legions? Do you stand as a guard, your presence alone enough to ward off thieves? Do you slip into the shadows, collecting debts with fists and blades? Or do you try to abandon violence altogether, trading the sword for the plow, the roar of the crowd for the silence of the fields? Could you truly walk away from the life that had defined you? For many, the answer was no. Survival demanded compromise, and compromise meant returning, in one way or another, to violence. Rome rewarded strength, but only so long as it was useful. The moment a man's skills dulled, the moment his body failed, his place vanished. Teaching, guarding, surviving, these were not permanent solutions, but temporary stays of execution. The decline always loomed, and the shadow of poverty never left. In this way, the life beyond the sand was not freedom in the true sense, but another arena, another fight. The enemies were different: hunger, poverty, suspicion, decline, but the stakes were the same: life or death. The gladiator had survived the Colosseum. Now he had to survive Rome itself. The roar of the arena faded, the sands washed clean, and the crowd dispersed into the streets of Rome. But what remained of the gladiator? For men who lived their lives beneath the eyes of thousands, death or retirement was not the end of their story. Their memory lingered in taverns, in whispers, in graffiti on the city's walls, in songs sung by drunkards late into the night. For some, their legacy was carved into stone and celebrated for generations. For others, it vanished like dust, their names erased, their bodies forgotten in unmarked graves. The question of how gladiators were remembered was as complex as their lives. They were heroes and villains, idols and outcasts, legends and nobodies, often all at once. The most successful fighters became folk legends, their names living on long after they had left the sand. Rome's walls were filled with graffiti celebrating champions. Crescens, the netman, wins again, or Celadus makes the girls sigh. These were not mere scratches of admiration. They were proof that the crowd held these men in their hearts, that their feats were woven into the fabric of everyday life. Some gladiators became as well known as generals, their images stamped into lamps, painted on walls, or sold as cheap souvenirs. Their likenesses were etched into memory not by official decree, but by the devotion of the masses who adored them. In death, some were honored with monuments. Wealthy patrons sometimes commissioned tombs for favored fighters, decorating them with carvings of their greatest victories. These tombs stood as eternal arenas, stone spectacles that told the story of a life fought in blood. Inscriptions praised their courage, their endurance, their skill with sword or net. To the passerby, these monuments made gladiators immortal, their names etched into Rome's landscape, even as their bodies lay in the earth. For families of the poor, whose loved ones had fought and died in obscurity, smaller memorials, clay plaques, painted stones served the same purpose, ensuring that the fighter's memory endured, however modestly. Yet not all legacies were honored. Many gladiators died nameless, their bodies carted away with little more than a sigh from the crowd. For every champion whose deeds lived on, hundreds fell without record. Their bones were dumped into common graves, their names never spoken again. Rome remembered them only in the abstract, as part of the spectacle, not as men. To die forgotten was the fate of most, a silence that swallowed their lives as surely as the sand had swallowed their blood. Still, memory was not only carved in stone or whispered in taverns, it lived in scandal, too. Romans of the elite classes loved to mock women who adored gladiators, spreading gossip about their affairs and sneering at the idea that these tainted men could inspire passion. Yet even in mockery, the gladiators' memory was kept alive. Every joke told about them, every scandal repeated in hushed tones, was another thread in the web of legacy. They may have been condemned as infames, but they were never ignored. For some, memory became power. Retired gladiators who survived long enough to see their fame endure could capitalize on it. They became symbols of endurance, figures whom others looked to as proof that survival was possible. In communities of the poor, their stories inspired hope, their scars admired as proof of resilience. For children who dreamed of escape from poverty, the gladiator was both warning and promise, a reminder of the price of glory and the possibility of rising above obscurity. But memory could also be cruel. Many ex-gladiators found themselves trapped by their reputations. They were remembered not as men, but as killers, brutes, animals. Employers distrusted them, neighbors feared them, officials condemned them. No matter how hard they tried to reinvent themselves as farmers, as guards, as trainers, their legacy followed. They could not escape the image carved in the minds of others, the blood-stained figure on the sand. Memory, in this sense, was a prison as much as a monument. Even centuries later, the memory of gladiators endured. Writers and poets retold their stories, sometimes glorifying them, sometimes condemning them as symbols of Rome's decadence. Artists painted them, sculptors carved them, dramatists staged plays about them. The gladiator became a cultural icon, larger than the men themselves had ever been. Their legacy was reshaped, exaggerated, mythologized. A single fight could be transformed into legend, a single scar into symbol. Over time, the real lives of gladiators were blurred, their struggles forgotten beneath the weight of myth. Imagine yourself as one of them. You stand in the arena, cheered by thousands. You know that one day your body will fall, your voice will fade, and only memory will remain. What will that memory be? Will your name be scratched into walls, sung in taverns, etched into stone? Or will you vanish, lost among the countless who died unremembered? Would you cling to fame, no matter how fleeting, or would you prefer obscurity free from gossip and scorn? Could you bear being remembered as a hero to some, a disgrace to others? The truth of gladiators' memory is this: they were never remembered as men. They were remembered as symbols, as stories, as entertainment. Their humanity was lost, consumed by the roles they played for the crowd. Idol or outcast, hero or villain, champion or slave, their legacy was never their own. It was shaped by the voices of others, carved into stone by patrons, whispered by the poor, mocked by the elite, retold by poets. In life, they fought for survival. In death, they fought for memory. And just as in the arena, only a few truly triumphed. The amphitheater is behind you now. The roar of the crowd that once shook your bones has faded into silence. In your hand rests the rudes, the wooden sword that marks your freedom. You have survived the games, the blood, the beasts, and the endless battles against men just as desperate as you. But as you walk into the streets of Rome, another question hangs over you. Can you survive what comes after? This was the cruelest irony of all that freedom. The prize every gladiator dreamed of was often a harsher trial than the arena itself. For most fighters, the end of their career did not bring peace. It brought hunger. Without steady income, many found themselves penniless within weeks. Rome did not reward gladiators with pensions or land. The arena gave only fleeting fame and scars. A few champions received gifts from patrons, gold, houses, or slaves, but most were discarded the moment the games ended. Imagine stepping into freedom with nothing but your battered body and a reputation that frightened as many as it impressed. How long could you last? The body itself was the first obstacle. Years of combat left bones cracked, joints ruined, skin marred. Pain followed every movement. Some gladiators could no longer swing a sword. Others limped through the streets as crippled shadows of their former selves. Without physicians, without medicine, their bodies became prisons. You might have survived the sand, but could you survive your own decline? Could you resist the lure of wine, the temptation to drown agony and drink until nothing remained but ruin? Enemies waited too. Rivals who had fallen to your blade remembered. Families of the men you had killed might still thirst for vengeance. Even strangers bore grudges, merchants who had lost bets when you triumphed, jealous men whose wives admired your scars, officials who despised your infamia. In the streets of Rome there were no rules, no referees, no crowd to judge mercy or cruelty. Every alley could be a trap, every tavern a place where a knife might find your ribs. Would you trust your reputation to shield you, or would you walk forever in fear of shadows? Then came the problem of identity. You were once a spectacle, the center of attention, a man who drew screams from thousands. Now you are simply another figure in the crowd. How do you live without the roar, without the adrenaline, without the purpose of battle? Many could not. They returned to the arena, volunteering for fights they no longer had the strength to win. Others threw themselves into gambling, seeking the thrill of chance to replace the thrill of combat. Some chased fame in taverns, boasting of old victories until their words rang hollow. Would you find meaning in obscurity, or would you be consumed by the addiction to glory? And yet there were paths to survival. Teaching offered stability, passing on the arts of combat to young nobles, shaping their bodies and their courage. Guarding provided income. Standing tall at a merchant's villa, your scars a deterrent to thieves. Even farming, for those who could endure its monotony, offered peace that the arena never had. A few men carved out new lives, humble but steady, proving that survival was possible. Could you accept such work, or would pride refuse to let you bend? Would you cling to the image of the champion, even as hunger gnawed at your stomach? Society itself would test you at every turn. To the masses you remained a hero, cheered in taverns, admired for your scars. But to Rome's elite you were always an infamous, unworthy of respect, barred from true honor. You lived in contradiction, idolized and despised, loved and hated. Every smile hid a sneer, every gift carried strings. Would you have the strength to endure this constant tension, to live as both hero and outcast? And then, in the quiet hours, memory would rise. The faces of those you had slain, the roar of the crowd, the smell of blood, all would haunt your nights. Survival was not only a matter of food and coin, but of the soul. Could you find peace with the past, or would it consume you, dragging you into despair? Imagine this life as your own. You have walked through death and emerged alive. You hold freedom in your hands, but freedom is no guarantee of survival. Hunger stalks you. Pain gnaws at you. Enemies lurk. Pride tempts. Addiction beckons. Society scorns. Silence haunts. Would you endure? Could you truly survive the retirement of a Roman gladiator? The answer is not simple. Few did. For every man who built a new life, dozens fell to poverty, violence, or despair. Some became teachers, guards, or farmers. Others drank themselves to death or gambled away their last coin. Many vanished into the streets, forgotten by the very crowds who once screamed their names. Survival after the arena was not a victory but another test, one most failed. And so as you consider the question, remember this: to survive the games was rare, but to survive freedom was rarer still. The gladiator's retirement was not a triumphal march into peace. It was another battlefield, one without applause, without honor, without mercy. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was the hardest fight of all. So would you survive a gladiator's retirement?